So how to deal with conflict, that's one of the biggest things a lot of us have to wrestle through in Christian leadership, isn't it? It seems like it never really ever ends sometimes. I know that. Hey, I'm Terry Linhart. I wrote The Self-Aware Leader, and in there I wrote a chapter on managing conflict. And it's been an area I've had to work through, and I devoted a lot of time on this chapter. I talked a lot about passive aggressiveness as well, which I think is much more common in Christian ministries. What I wanted to do is just spend a minute or two here and give you 5 ways that you can handle conflict better. I've learned these through the years. I've taught them to the leaders that I developed, and these 5 steps, if you put them into place right this week, will help you handle conflict better. And the first one is to work in slowly from the edges of the puzzle, meaning that if you have a conflict situation, when we put a puzzle together, we don't just run through the middle, we frame it, right? We put all the pieces together around the edge, and then we work in from the edges. And if you seek to clarify before you confront, you're going to solve a lot of problems, because if you're like me and you're a little bit of a driver and you want to fix things, then you can sometimes get going too fast and you run to the middle too quickly, and you might do something that actually causes more damage, it causes more conflict, and is more difficult then to unpack. So work in slowly from the edges of the puzzle. The second thing you need to do as a leader is to make sure you've identified and labeled clearly what the issue is. If you're a parent or you grew up in a family, you know that sometimes people can get mad about something, like maybe the dog did something and they really react strongly. But the anger isn't necessarily about the dog, it's another issue over here. And I've worked with leaders at the local level, at the district level, at the national level sometimes, and help them work through some conflict to the point where when they've identified it and they've labeled it, it isn't exactly what they thought. One of the best things you can do about conflict is the third thing, is just to let the emotions of it fade. I think sometimes the verse that says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, has caused us to have to feel like in the moment we got to fix it. And you'll do better if you let everybody just catch their breath and let it fade. And there are 2 ways I think that you can do this. One is to limit strong statements. Some personality types want to just say whatever comes to their mind. I'm one of those. I want to fix things, right? And then other people at the other end of the personality spectrum can get defensive. So the second thing you want to do is to resist being defensive, right? We can get into a cocoon, and we've so protected ourselves through the years that we can get very defensive, and we're not open to realize that there may be a conflict that we have to deal with. So let the emotions fade and be careful of what you say, and when there's an appropriate time and you've identified and labeled what's going on, you can work on it. The fourth thing that you can do is to make sure you're handling conflict appropriately. I remember stepping into a denominational setting where the conflict had so arrested all the leaders they couldn't function because they didn't know how to proceed forward. And you just helped them walk through what are the issues, and now they're functioning well. Some of the same people are getting along famously, but in the moment, because we just don't know how to handle it appropriately. So here are 3 things I think that will help you handle it appropriately. First, don't have conflict in front of others. Second thing is, don't do conflict on social media. Get face to face. And here's the theory behind that, right? Most of our communication is nonverbal. How we present ourselves is so very important in communication. And speaking of communication, the third thing is, don't have an absence of communication when things are tense. And also, don't over communicate. So here's this balance there, and this gets really tricky. Communicate effectively and appropriately, and here's the way to do that, is write up what you think you need to communicate to your people, and have 2 or 3 of those people review it. Not just the ones that will say anything you want to hear, but someone that'll give you honest feedback, where you can say, does this sound okay? And that's what good leaders do. They communicate well, they handle conflict appropriately, and it's not a public scene. Finally then, be in prayer. And I don't mean to over-spiritualize this, but really God's in the center of this. The Bible's full of moments of conflict, right? Barnabas, one of my favorite characters in the Bible, is gone from the pages of Scripture the moment that he and Saul have that sharp dispute together. And yet he was a man of encouragement. He was a man that helped get Paul into the church and in with the other apostles. And yet an argument later, and he was off the scene of the pages. I know that some of you are in situations where you're under someone who's controlling or particularly antagonistic. I've been in those situations before, and I remember there was a period of probably a year in my life in ministry where I really felt like that I was climbing on the cross with Christ almost. That when Paul says I've been crucified with Christ, that day anything about me didn't matter. I was going to serve in this setting in a high moment of conflict for a period of time because of a particular situation that was going on. A year later, it was remedied, but for that year, it was difficult. Some of you are in difficult seasons, and that's why I say be in prayer. God can use you in the midst of conflict.